I am so incredibly delighted that Liz Pretjohn accepted our invitation to be the opening keynote speaker for this conference, because for me it is a jumping off point for 3 days that really discussed an artist we all felt we knew through the new lens of his home and studio environments. And I think what's interesting is 2 years later, it's a wonderful opportunity to check back in with Liz about what these types of convenings can mean for this discourse. So Dr. Elizabeth Pretjohn, Liz, is a professor of history of art at the University of York. She has many distinctive publications to her name, and we'll discuss today sort of the outcomes. I don't want to really talk about the exhibition on Alma Tadema because she will walk us through that. So her keynote today is Alma Tadema at Home in Antiquity. Please welcome Liz Pretjohn.
Right, well, thank you, Valerie, for that lovely introduction, and thank you, everybody here at the Mellon Center and in the all of the wonderful organizations that have organized this for making this possible. Just to say, my title is the ideal title for the exhibition that we did in 2016 and 17, not exactly the actual title, and I'll explain that later. But first, I want to go to the backstory and tell you how we came up with this, right back to the first exhibition on Alma Tadema that I was involved in 1996. And this was a collaboration between the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam and the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool. I'm showing you the cover of the catalogue, already looking a little yellowed with time. 20 years ago wasn't so very long, and the exhibition was pioneering in its way. It demonstrated just how serious Lawrence Alma Tadema was as a painter of classical antiquity and how inventive he was as the archaeologist of artists. By the way, it reintroduced Alma Tadema to audiences in his own native country, the Netherlands, where he was then very little known. We learned subsequently that the catalogue and its illustrations of Tadema's works became the design inspiration for Ridley Scott's films Gladiator and Exodus. So, we certainly achieved one of our aims. The exhibition showed how compelling was Alma Tadema's vision of the ancient world and how it could still be compelling for audiences of today. Indeed, two ancient worlds, Rome and Egypt. But at that date, 1996, it didn't even occur to us that Alma Tadema's two studio houses might be a focus for the exhibition. They seemed to be most appropriately dealt with as context for his artistic production. So Julian Treuherz, my collaborator and the prime mover behind that exhibition, Julian wrote a catalogue essay entitled Alma Tadema, Aesthete, Architect, and Interior Designer. And in retrospect, that was a very important piece of work. I strongly recommend looking at it in the catalogue for anybody who wants to learn more. But at the time, Julian's essay seemed to be merely an adjunct to the main project of presenting Lawrence Alma Tadema as an artist. In fact, Julian and I went to the site of the second Tadema house on Grove End Road in St. John's Wood and traipsed around in the garden till somebody told us to leave. This painting by Edith Corbett shows the garden towards the end of Tadema's lifetime. It certainly didn't look like that when Julian and I walked round it. It was entirely neglected, and the house, although recognizable, was dilapidated. At that date, it was divided into flats, none too salubrious. The magnificent studio interior, which I'm showing you here in a 19th century photograph, was divided into two floors. One family lived in the bottom bit and another in the top bit with the semi-dome and the curving ceilings. And that splendid Mexican onyx window, which we'll see again later, and the other furnishings and fittings had long ago been removed. Now, in 1993, we knew that Tadema's wife, Laura, had been a practicing artist, but again, it didn't even occur to us to ask what her work looked like or whether it might be an appropriate focus in its own right. Similarly, we didn't ask about Tadema's two daughters by his first marriage. Their mother, Pauline, died tragically, so that the girls were brought up by Laura. While we were working on the exhibition, the Van Gogh Museum bought this painting of the two daughters. This is our corner of 1873, and it shows the two little girls in their private corner of one of the interiors of the first Tadema studio house, Townsend House on the north side of Regent's Park. But we included the painting in the exhibition, naturally, but it didn't occur to us to look further at the Townsend House interiors. I don't think I was even aware at that date that one of the two daughters, Anna, was later to become a very interesting artist in her own right. On the left is a portrait of Anna Alma-Tadema by her father, which we did feature in the exhibition, and with good reason. It's a stunning work. But we didn't spend much time on researching the setting, which seems to be in the downstairs hall at Townsend House and features its characteristic gray-green hues, as well as an interesting glimpse of the conservatory behind the figure. On the right of this slide are 3 watercolors by Anna Alma-Tadema, which show other interiors at Townsend House as they appeared in the early 1880s, just before the family left that house. And just to make sure the rest of my talk is comprehensible, the Tadema family created 2 successive studio houses in London. Both of them were pre-existing houses, remodeled and redecorated to become something quite extraordinary. Townsend House was begun just after Lawrence and Laura married in 1871, and they lived there with the 2 girls until the mid-1880s, when the daughters were approaching their 20s. It was famous for the gray-green tonalities of its interiors, the Japanese tatami matting on the floor, and its sequence of rooms created by the very simple expedient of removing all the interior doors of the pre-existing house to create essentially an open plan interior. Now, that house no longer exists. In the mid-1880s, the family moved to a larger house with a larger garden in Grove End Road, St. John's Wood. This became known affectionately as Casa Tadema, and that house does still exist. It's just near that zebra crossing made famous by the Beatles on their album cover, though it is the house is privately owned and cannot, alas, be visited. The house had previously been occupied by the painter James Tissot, and the Tademas kept some features, particularly in the gardens, but they remodeled and extended the house dramatically. I'm showing 2 drawings for the remodeling, along with the painting by Edith Corbett showing part of the garden and a back view of the house towards the end of the Tademas period there. Okay. Back to my story in the 1990s, when we knew little or nothing about the houses and didn't think to ask the most basic questions. What role did the houses play in the creation of Alma-Tadema's works, the ones that we were showing in the exhibition? Who created the house interiors? What were the roles of Laura and the 2 daughters, not to mention the many sisters, cousins, aunts, uncles, and friends who were also involved? What kinds of art making did they pursue within these 2 houses, and how did the whole artistic family enterprise work together? Although we didn't realize it at the time, we were guilty of presenting a very patriarchal and misleading account of Alma-Tadema's artistic production. Fast forward 16 years or so to 2012, when Margot Brandl-Huber was planning this exhibition at the Museum Villa Stuck in Munich. In the Temple of the Self, the artist's residence is a total work of art, and I'm showing you the front and back covers of the catalog. Margot asked me to contribute the section on the Alma-Tadema houses, and that opened my eyes. I could now see the Tadama houses as an integral part of a distinctive kind of artistic activity that extended across Europe and North America and involved many fascinating artists. It was a couple of years later that Frank van de Velden contacted me. He was head of collections of the Fries Museum in Leeuwarden, Alma Tadema's hometown, and asked me to collaborate on a new exhibition. Soon we had a curatorial team, which also involved Marley Stota at the Fries Museum, and crucially, Peter Trippi, who's also been mentioned from New York. I think many of you know Peter and will know how dynamic he is, as well as amazingly expert on the art of this period. Peter and I had already collaborated in the exhibition on John William Waterhouse, also with Marianne, who's here today. So this was the ideal curatorial team to bring together. The Fries Museum wanted to celebrate their local boy, but they also wanted to tell a new story about him. After the previous show, Alma Tadema was best known as the archaeologist of artists, the painter of scenes from ancient everyday life, informed by new data from the vast archaeological explorations of the second half of the 19th century. We didn't want to neglect that story, but we wanted to avoid a simplistic presentation of Tadema's pictures as merely Victorians in togas. We started with some germs of ideas that at first seemed rather random and oddly assorted. Thanks to a generous benefactor, the Fries Museum, Friesland's historical museum, had a brand new building with glamorous cinema facilities. So the curators were interested in exploring the influence that Tadema's paintings were known to have had on both European cinema and Hollywood, but which had never really been properly researched. And for this aspect, we were joined by another colleague, the film historian Ivo Blom from the Vrije University in Amsterdam. The Fries Museum also had a bequest from the Tadema daughters, which included numerous items from the family's 2 London studio houses. And that chimed with my newfound interest, spurred by Margot's show at the Villa Stuck, in looking at the artist's studio as an environment or a kind of laboratory for art making. And again, although we'd known before that Tadema's second wife, Laura Teresa Epps, was a practicing artist in her own right, that was starting to seem more and more important with the rise of feminist art history. From these disparate germs, a new set of questions began to emerge. What if the studio houses were not just signs of the wealth and success of the male artist, Lawrence Alma Tadema? What if they could be described more intriguingly as collaborations between Laura and Lawrence Alma Tadema that resulted not so much in luxury houses as in total works of art? 3-dimensional spaces for art making and artistic experience. And what if it was that approach to lived experience, being surrounded by and moving through and living in an artistic space, that was inspirational for the creators of early cinema? So, we had the sense that we had a new story to tell, but how to realize it in the exhibition space, and as it turned out, in fact, the exhibition toured to 3 very different spaces: an Ormond Cons building, just a few years old, a Viennese royal palace of the 18th century, and a historic house. On the bottom, the studio house belonging not to the Tademas, but to their contemporary and friend, Frederick Leighton. Now, I'd love to have time today to tell you the whole story of the exhibition, but I do want to move on to some of the implications, as Valerie was saying. So I'll just have to direct you to British Art Studies, which Sarah mentioned at the beginning, the wonderful publication of the Mellon Center here, issue 9, which has a good write-up of many of the aspects of the exhibition and other interesting material, and of course to the exhibition catalog itself, which is actually continued to sell very well after the exhibition, so it's about to come out in a 2nd edition now, which is a sign, I think, of how the idea really has caught light. I'll just walk you through the 3 shows so you can get a flavor, but I'm going to move very fast so that we can move on to the further implications. At the Frieze Museum, the first venue, and here is the magnificent banner extending through 3 floors of the Frieze Museum, so that you felt you were on the terrace with the women looking over the edge. The colors in the exhibition were meant to evoke the different studio environments for Tadema in quite an abstract way. We began with a bit on the films, then we moved through his first Dutch environment with black walls, then through his Brussels studio, which had red walls. But you can see this is quite an abstract design just for evoking the interior spaces without trying to recreate them. We also included many of the objects from the studios, which also appear in the pictures. And these vitrines are really very cleverly organized, so that so that you can look at the objects in conjunction with the pictures in which the objects appear. And here are more of the objects in the studio houses, many of which we'll come back to later. And as the exhibition progresses, there's a gradual sort of lightening in the tone, characteristic of the way the houses developed over time. So here we're moving through the Townsend House period and into the final period in Grove End Road. In this final large room, we also had projections seen above the painting, so that here you see Connie Nielsen in Gladiator in a costume inspired by the pictures underneath it, and on the right, a scene from Louis Feuillard's L'Orgie Romaine of 1911 with its shower of rose petals inspired by Tadema's most famous painting below. In Vienna, we had a very different look at the Belvedere Gallery, with these deep claret-colored walls and very big spaces, much more difficult to work with the small paintings. But this at least allowed a very generous presentation of Laura Alma-Tadema's work. And I'll just move through the exhibition so you can get a certain sense of what it was like, and the film clips were positioned at the very end there. Finally, at Leighton House Museum in London, we felt that the exhibition had genuinely come home. At last, we were able to present the work in an artist studio house, and I'm very glad that we'll get the chance to see those spaces later on today. So here we are moving again through the different periods of Tadema's career, and I think you can see how well the pictures suit the space. Up the stairs, into the bedroom, and through the various spaces in Leighton House. Sumptuous presentation. The designer came up with this inventive partition scheme in the middle of Leighton's studio, which allowed us not to confuse the material from the Tadema studios in this partitioned area with the larger studio of Leighton's. Again, there was lots of space given to Laura, and this is on the outside of the partition within Leighton House. And finally, on to the last room in Leighton House, where some of the major big paintings were presented. And I'm just finishing with the 2 covers to the exhibition catalog. Sorry, they're a bit squashed on the slide. The cover on the left, which was actually used as the exhibition catalog version in the Netherlands, had the marketing image they wanted with all the sunshine and so forth, but we didn't think that really went too well with the idea of the house interior and the studio house. We wanted the image on the right, Unconscious Rivals from Bristol, which we'll look at again later. And that subtitle, At Home in Antiquity. We really wanted that. We actually wanted something slightly different, and the one on the right is the book version, which was sold in London and is still sold on Amazon, for example. We actually wanted the title just to say Alma-Tadema, At Home in Antiquity, but we were told actually by the marketing people at the publisher that was absolutely unacceptable, and that the only way a book would sell was if it had the name of a male artist as its main title. So it had to be called Lawrence Alma-Tadema, At Home in Antiquity. That was in 2016, just before the start of the Me Too campaign. And since then, there has, as we all know, been ever-increasing interest in the roles of women artists and the contribution of women to the arts in all kinds of ways. I wonder whether that conversation would go a bit differently now. Okay. I'd like now to spend the rest of the time talking about the results and implications of the exhibitions, and I've taken the conference's keyword homework to suggest the further kinds of work we might need to do. I'd like to talk about 3 kinds of work. First, detective work. Townsend House is no longer extant, and Casa Tadema has been altered dramatically. In the exhibition and the exhibition catalog, we made a start at piecing together what the houses were like and how they worked, but only a start, and there's still much more to do, in this case as in that of other artists' houses. So let's start with Townsend House. One of its best documented spaces, not surprisingly, was Lawrence Alma-Tadema's studio, although there are still questions. It was entered dramatically through a narrow, dark corridor, as in an ancient Roman or Pompeian house, and then the space opens out into a much brighter space, like an ancient court or atrium, although, of course, this is London, so the room is closed in and roofed. Also adorned with Pompeian-style painting by Tadema himself. Now here we're seeing 2 representations of the approach which correspond pretty closely with each other. On the left is an illustration from the first biographical article about Alma-Tadema, written by his brother-in-law, the writer Edmund Goss, and published in 1883, which shows, I think, that there was very considerable critical interest in the Tadema houses from the very start. This is lavishly illustrated with very interesting representations of the house. Now, the painting on the right is by Tadema's sister-in-law, that is Laura's sister, Emily, whose married name was Emily Williams. And that painting is a marvel of fine detail and effective tonal contrast, as well as highly informative about the studio contents. And we've been able to identify and sometimes to locate many of the objects that are represented. The easel, which we'll see later. There's a reproduction silver bowl. You might just be able to see it from the Hildesheim treasure. It's still at the Friese Museum, Tadema's reproduction version, Egyptian stool, and other Egyptian-style objects based on objects in the British Museum. And seen in many Tadema paintings, the picture on the easel, the cupboard with the green shelves, still in the Friese Museum, statuette of the Farnese, Hercules, and many more. You can just piece apart the picture and put it back together again. Here are some further views of the studio, illustrations, and on the bottom right, a photograph. And again, with detective work, we can trace almost every object, and their histories are fascinating and informative. Just call attention to this bust of Laura, probably by their friend, the Italian sculptor Giovanni Battista Amendola, and the textile behind it, which is actually a sumptuous gold hanging. This portrait of Laura by Lawrence, interrupted, shows her in the studio with her bust and the hanging behind it. The portrait was made for the Graphic magazine in 1880, so it's both witty. It shows her interrupted as she reads a copy of the Graphic. And it's also a tribute to her and to the couple's shared artistic pursuit. So it's quite fitting that it's set so clearly in the studio house they created together. The textile's still in the Friese Museum collection. You can see it displayed in a case here. And it was also used for the hangings of the barge in one of Tadema's most famous paintings, Cleopatra, the painting that achieved the record price at Sotheby's of $29 million in 2011. Note, by the way, that same display in the Friese Museum has the easel, which again went to the Friese Museum as part of the Tadema daughter's bequest, and which is prominent in Emily Williams's painting of the studio interior. Okay, what about Laura's studio? As might be expected, there's less surviving documentation here, but what there is of considerable interest. This is an illustration from an article by Wilfred Meynell, husband of the poet and critic Alice Meynell, who was the sister of the battle painter Elizabeth Butler. When you start tracing the family connections in this story, you go forever. Anyway, it shows Laura's studio on the ground floor, which was formed of a sequence of interlocking rooms, and the decoration was actually more experimental than the relatively straightforward Pompeian look of Lawrence's studio. According to contemporary accounts, it included Spanish leather, Japanese matting. There's plants all over the place, interior and exterior, getting sort of interplanted penetrated. Panel paintings, Japanese matting. It seems to have opened into the conservatory, which had an Indian hammock as well as a Roman-style impluvium and Chinese lanterns. More detective work is needed to piece together not only the contents of these rooms, but also the way they were experienced. That simple expedient of removing the doors created more open and flowing spaces than usual in London houses at this date, and the Tadamas used layers and layers of textiles and objects to inflect and energize the movement through the spaces. Doorways and thresholds were always crucial and treated in myriad ways. And here are two works by Laura with figures in historical dress inhabiting what appear to be the interiors of Townsend House. The oil painting on the right, a Bible lesson of 1883, shows figures in historical dress with Dutch blue and white tiles and a glimpse through an opening on the right to the farther room, a compositional device reminiscent of Dutch 17th century painting. The watercolor of 1881 on the left, May I Come In, again shows a doorway or threshold, and the characteristic tatami matting, seen in both pictures, and another innovation that would have interesting entailments, the tall vertical door panels. You see them in lots of doors, but here they've been painted by friends of the artists, probably originally for fun. The light colorings characteristic of Townsend House, according to contemporary descriptions, and notice this white settle on the left with its shiny ball finial. This seems to be a piece of purpose-built furniture, and we will see it again. Now, at this date, it's actually Laura who seems to be using the house interiors to suggest ideas for paintings. As we'll see, that idea would become equally important to Lawrence, but I think it's Laura who first experiments with it. Here's the Gold Room in a watercolor by Anna Alma-Tadema, so exquisitely crafted in naturalistic detail that one might think it was a color photograph. Of course, color photography wasn't possible at this date. This is the start of the sequence of drawing rooms in the upstairs space. And notice the treatment of the threshold, punctuated at the top by recesses holding pottery, Dutch pottery, and ancient glass, inflected on one side by an ancient bust, probably a reproduction of a celebrated bust of Antinous, Hadrian's favorite, and a Dutch chair, and on the other side by a magnificent Chinese textile in white silk with gold embroidery. On the mantelpiece, you can see various things, an electrotype reproduction of a conical vase from the Hildesheim treasure, and a statuette of Laura in a rocking chair, again by a Mendola. Then there's the Byzantine piano, made specially for the Tadamas by Broadwood, and behind that, the window in Mexican onyx. Here in the middle image is the portrait by Tadema of the singer and composer Georg Henschel playing that Byzantine piano in the Gold Room with another sumptuous textile behind him, and you can see just a tiny slice of the onyx window on the right. And on the right of this slide is a view of the nearby alcove space by yet another family friend, Edith Hipkins. Just a couple more examples. We already saw the tall panel by Emily Williams of Tadema's studio at Townsend House, and I'm showing you next to it another panel by Emily Williams showing a view from the next drawing room in the sequence back into the Gold Room, so you can see the onyx window and the piano stool here, through the open doorway, which is marked by that kind of red curtain, this leading you through the spaces. Now, the two paintings on the right of this slide are by another of Laura's sisters, Ellen, nicknamed Nellie, the sister who married Edmund Goss. And in the first one, she shows that same columned room as in Emily Williams' panel to the left of it, with its complicated arrangement of curtains. And you see here the two Tadema daughters playing amongst them, great place for hide and seek. On the far right, Nellie shows Laura in the so-called Dutch room downstairs. Notice things like the William Morris pomegranate wallpaper, the Dutch furniture and portraits, blue and white china, and multiple rugs. And in all these representations, notice how there are layers upon layers of patterns, colors, and objects. Here on the left is Anna Almatadama's watercolor of the view into the columned drawing room, again with one of those wonderful curtains, and that bird cage. The bird cage is actually an important 17th century Dutch object, and it's now in the V&A. You can see it in the middle of this slide. And on the right is Emily Williams' panel showing the same space the other way round, looking back into the gold room, but with the bird cage as this interesting mediating thing between rooms. So, many artist friends as well as family members made paintings and watercolors depicting the house interiors, and we can use these alongside the written descriptions, also by friends as well as by journalists of the house interiors, to piece together information, and there is still tons to do. These are a couple of works by Tadema's cousins, another artist couple. On the left, Sientje van Houten, who married the Hague maritime painter Hendrik Willem Mesdag, and I'm just showing you one of his seascapes on the right. The Mesdags, as you may know, also had a stunning studio house in The Hague. They owned many works by the Tademas, some of which showed the Tadema house interiors. So these two artists' houses were actually sort of interlinked with images and also physical objects. Now, the landscape by Sientje on the left appears to correspond to that right-hand door panel in Laura's watercolor, May I Come In? And when the family moved to their next house, that panel was installed, along with many other panels by Emily Williams and other friends and family, in a new display, a whole hall of panels by family and friends. So that's it on the extreme left. And notice that we also have got a version of the settle with the ball finial, which has been moved and reinstalled in Casa Tadema. That brings us to Casa Tadema, the family's next studio house, which they created from the mid-1880s onwards. As I mentioned before, they took over the house from James Tissot, who was moving back to Paris, and remodeled it considerably. There doesn't seem to have been an architect involved, although they had some help from Alfred Calderon, the architect son of their friend and near neighbor, the painter Philip Hermogenes Calderon. In other words, they seem to have designed and decorated the spaces themselves. And here's a working drawing for the side elevation of the new studio, and another showing the entrance side, approximately north-facing with this huge studio window. Below it, the door has that Latin greeting, Salve, and here you can see a painting by Tadema, which actually imagines a marble room up above it, overlooking what's the real doorway of the Grove End Road house, and some kind of romantic intrigue going on in the space. Now here's the plan of the ground floor. You can see this is the big new studio on at an angle on the right-hand side. But here is Laura's studio space with its antique bedroom, which we'll see in a second. As you can see, it's not that much smaller than the space given over to her husband's studio. On the first floor, we see Anna's studio and bedroom, which are over Laura's, and very much also, they all have this north-facing view. And on the top floor, something called Mrs. Williams's room. I think probably that was assigned to Laura's sister, Emily Williams, who's now a widow. So there seem to have been 4 working artists in this house, 3 of them women, and they all had studio spaces arranged to get the north light. Now, Lawrence's studio was admittedly the grandest one, and although it might not have taken up that much more of the floor space, it was double height. And here at the top left is a watercolor by Dutch artist Nicolas van de Wey, who visited and recorded the house in the 1890s. It shows the sheen of the semi-dome covered in aluminium, which you can see better there than in these photographs on the bottom and right. But all the photos show how the new design incorporated different levels and many vistas from one space to another. And here's another photo of the studio, this time from the sale catalog for the house after Tadema's death. It shows a large unfinished painting on the easel, Cleopatra at Filly, now at the V&A, and many of the objects we've seen before in representations of Townsend House or in pictures by the Tademas and their friends, including that basketwork stool from the studio at Townsend House and Tadema's gardening hat on it. Interestingly, John William Waterhouse seems to have drawn on Tadema's studio for the setting of one of his largest paintings, the biblical Mariamne of 1887. See the apse and the semidome behind the figure and the glimpse of the window in the niche on the right. What about Laura's studio? Oops. Here she is, at work with Anna, looking over her shoulder in an illustration in the Graphic magazine from 1888. And here are photos of her studio space. Her husband had gone for an imperial or Byzantine look in his studio, but Laura chooses a Dutch look filled with 17th century Dutch furniture and paneling and shuttered windows with pictured glass. And very clearly, this studio is the setting for her paintings. This photo shows the entrance to the smaller second room within her studio space with its elaborate paneling around the door, and within the room, a Flemish 17th century bed, quite an important piece that appeared in the sale catalogue after the family left the house. And it's the setting for one of Laura's best works, Bright Be Thy Noon of 1894. Another particularly good work by Laura is this one, A Looking Out of the Window of 1893. Notice the skillful painting of the reflection on the window pane here. Unusually, this is not set in Laura's studio, but I think it is another window in the house, part of the big bay window in the drawing room overlooking the garden, as we see it here in the sale catalogue, but it derives from Tissot's period in the house, as we can see in this illustration from 1874 in the Building News. What about Anna's studio? I think our detective work allows us to identify this too as the room in which she represents herself and her self-portrait. The oval window and the ledge on which objects are placed correspond to this photograph from the sale catalogue for the house, which corresponds to the position of the room identified as Anna's studio on the original floor plans. And we shouldn't forget Emily Williams, whose panel paintings helped us to do our detective work on Townsend House, and which then became part of the fabric of the new house in Grove End Road, where they joined the panel by Sintje Mesdag, also from Townsend House. The Tademas were literally embodying the memory of their previous house into the physical fabric of their new one. And the simple idea of painting a door panel turns into an extensive display of works by 40-odd artist friends. So the whole of panels also embeds the memories of those friendships. And the women artists here appear together with the most glamorous male artists, and here are some panels by Frederick Leighton and John Singer Sargent integrated with those by Sintje Mesdag and Emily Williams. Which brings me to my second kind of work, women's work. Townsend House and then Casa Tadema were signed all over and in various ways by the artists who created them, including by inserting their initials everywhere in the house. Previous scholars have often noticed those initials L.A.T. and commented on how insistently they inscribed the identity of Lawrence Alma Tadema on the surfaces of the house. It seems amazing, but no one noticed that Laura Alma Tadema had the same initials. When you see the initials, you're seeing both artists, often intertwined, and they're everywhere, on the walls, in the garden, on the furniture. In our detective work, we needed to call on the work of many women artists that were useful for the information they provided about the houses. But in the process, we noticed what very good artists those women were, although they were largely, if not entirely, forgotten. First and foremost, Laura Teresa Alma Tadema. It may indeed have been she who held the whole enterprise together. In practical terms, she ran the house, and it was she who pioneered the practice of using the house interiors as inspirations for her paintings. And we've already seen examples such as Bright Be Thy Noon, Sweet Industry, one of the few who made their way into public art collections, Manchester City Art Gallery, and again, particularly fine example, clearly set in the studio with the painted glass and Dutch furniture. Looking out of the window, including that bravura reflection on the glass, effects of this kind, and in this case, A Knock at the Door of 1897, the composition and lighting, these I think show that Laura was one of the first artists to make a serious study of the art of Vermeer, just being rediscovered when she was beginning her career as a painter. And here the pearl earring and its reflection in the window clearly recall Vermeer. The painting, Love's Beginning of 1904, has a glamorous provenance. It was shown at the Berlin Art Exhibition in 1906, where it won a gold medal and was purchased by the then Emperor William II. And during her lifetime, Laura Alma-Tadema was a very successful artist. It was only in the next generation that her work fell out of view. And this picture was very lost, neglected, and had a rather vexed history. Otherwise, I think it might look as sparkling as that other one, looking out a window, which is another very good example of why the work of these women artists is very difficult to recover. Here's another interesting work by Laura, Soon Ready of 1889, clearly set in the studio with its distinctive paneling, but now untraced, known only through this old photo. Laura's memorial exhibition at the Fine Arts Society in 1910 included 129 paintings, of which only a handful are now traced. No doubt lots more of them are still out there. Keep looking for them. But some of the damage done to them is irrevocable. The same is, of course, true of Anna, which I'm showing you here as a child in a painting by her stepmother Laura at the top left, already mad about art. As a teenager on the middle in her portrait by her father, showing her in a lovely aesthetic dress in the Townsend House interior, and in her self-portrait as a grown-up artist in her own studio at Grove End Road. This is an oil and it's rather dark. I hope you can see a bit of it. It's really rather nicely painted, subtly painted. But Anna seems to have been at her very best in watercolor, startling in their precision and detail, the three watercolors of Townsend House, and the way they represent also the fall and glow of light, which is one of the reasons they look so startlingly lifelike. This watercolor of 1902 was rediscovered by the Ashmolean, from their own collections. They included it in their Great British Drawings exhibition of 2015 because of its sheer quality, and it took the art world by surprise. We couldn't borrow it from the exhibition because everybody put in a loan request for it shortly thereafter, noticing its really sort of stunning quality. The other women we've seen, Laura's sisters Emily and Nellie, Lawrence's cousin Cynthia, and others who were just friends, such as Edith Hipkins and Edith Corbett. Those are forgotten artists, surely unjustly. True, their work has some of the limitations that have perhaps held back the cause of women artists. They tended to paint small-scale domestic subjects. But that brings us full circle. It's the domestic aspect, the relationship to the house and home, that interested us in their work in the first place. And that leads me to my final kind of work. I've now called this housework rather than homework, to remind us of the kind of work women do. Perhaps the most challenging and the most important result of our explorations of the Tadema houses is the insight that men can do housework too. If art making isn't just the preserve of the male artist genius, we've learned that domestic art isn't just the preserve of the women. The men can do it too, and that shows us new sides to their practice. In the later 20th century, when a Marxist social history of art was dominant, there was no slur worse than calling an artist bourgeois. Most Victorian artists, male and female, fell foul of that sense that somehow their work was bourgeois or domestic, understood as second-rate, insufficiently thrusting, and insufficiently politicized. Well, the politics look different now. And the new domestic narrative about Alma-Tadema, the artist surrounded by women who collaborates with them to create real domestic interiors and takes inspiration from those interiors for art making, that's opened up entirely new possibilities. Rather than the social history of art, we have a social world in which women participate as well as men. Rather than the lone male genius, we have houses full of artists, their family and friends making fine art and decorative art together. Bourgeois, yes, but in a good way. I don't have time to develop this idea fully today, and indeed I don't have a well-developed narrative argument about it yet, but that's work for the future. In the exhibition, though, the new domestic Alma Tadema persuaded some of our most hardened critics, the ones who normally hate Victorian art. For example, Waldemar Januszak of the Sunday Times, who found himself riveted by this painting for 45 minutes. The interior of San Clemente, painted on Alma Tadema's honeymoon trip to Rome in 1863 with his first wife, Pauline, just glimpsed disappearing behind a pillar. It was on this trip that Tadema famously discovered Roman archaeology, but it was also on this trip, I venture to argue, that he discovered his fascination with the domestic interior, the house or home. And that little head, by the way, I think could be Tadema himself, just glimpsed above the parapet at the rear. Now, certainly this painting is fascinating enough to rivet the attention for 45 minutes. It's mind-bogglingly exact. Here's a snapshot I took on the same site a couple of summers ago. And I think the memory of that sumptuous interior was still alive in Tadema's imagination when he created his own studio in Grove End Road more than 20 years later. By this date, Tadema has taken up the theme of Laura and making work in response to the studio interiors. Now the prevailing hue is a silvery one, he says, in this latest house, and that gives the purest reflections. By this point, we can see him taking up the practice of using the interiors to create paintings, as in examples such as Unconscious Rivals at the top left and In My Studio, both of 1893. He's using the levels and the vistas, the interiors and exteriors, the contents, the colors, the light and shade to generate ideas for paintings. His strategies for composition, lighting, the deployment of space are informed by the house as though it has become a great laboratory for artistic experimentation. In My Studio of 1893 shows the niche with the onyx window, and we know that under that embroidered Indian textile is the Byzantine piano from Townsend House. But is the figure in classical drapery one of Tadema's models, which would make this scene a scene from the modern life of a London artist? Or is she a revenant from classical antiquity? In The Golden Hour of 1908, the red-headed model contemplates a statuette version of Jean-Léon Gérôme's Hoop Dancer, itself a modern reinvention of an ancient Tanagra figurine. Its golden sheen is relieved against the silver of Alma Tadema's electrotype replica of the Krater, the most famous object from the Hildesheim treasure, a hoard of ancient silver unearthed in 1868. The onyx window glints in the background. The interplay between past and present, ancient and modern, memory and experience is complex in these examples. I finish with a different artist's house, Frank Lloyd Wright's in Oak Park, Illinois. We're accustomed to thinking of Wright as heralding modern architecture and art, in abrupt contrast to Tadema the Victorian. But notice the reproduction above the doorway in this photograph of the Wright Playroom. It's Alma Tadema's painting A Reading from Homer. And on second thoughts, the clean lines and architectural clarity of the Tadema painting make perfect sense in the Wright interior. Maybe the domestic Tadema made a more important contribution to modern art than we ever suspected.
Thank you, Liz. I think what a great start, because of course, through this imagery, we and many in the room who have come over from America will see these commonalities just happening immediately, from the paneled dining room at the Florence Griswold Museum, also containing works by friends, and playful competition to the small figurine at the very end that Daniel Chester French also had a series of figures similar to those that are still in the collection, to, of course, my previous place of employment, Alana, and just seeing it through a different lens. I want to open it for questions, and we have a very specific way of who has the microphones. We're going to request that, although people like to think they have great voice projection, that everybody use the microphone in parts that we can all hear and not have to repeat the question, but also for the sake of our technological recording that's happening. But I'd like to open with a question. I'm gonna let others perhaps deal with the three works that you. I was struck by this sort of fourth type of work that you sort of unraveled, and Alma Tadema is a perfect example of it, but I think it really does exist in lesser or greater degree upon which artist and which space we're talking about, which is the idea of artist as curator and collector, and how, in terms of your own work on this exhibition and this catalog, how, and actually compiling some of these, bringing back some of these objects for exhibition and working that out in relative to connoisseurship and lack of connoisseurship in some instances. Your thoughts on what type of work needs to be done in that area and how that may inform larger understanding of some of these other categories that you outlined?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question, and the answer could be very long. In a way, the thing that the sad thing is the disappearance of the house, but the lucky result of that is the sale catalog, which has 1,000 objects. I mean, the Leighton House has a similar. And so you can, I mean, and again, they're very difficult. A Dutch 17th century bed, for example, is difficult to, it might be, there's lots of possibilities for that, but I think there is a huge amount that one can do to trace back the collections, and it's very interesting in terms, what I find interesting is how artists' collecting activities are intersecting with wider collecting activities in the world at large. So artists who, even a very successful artist like Tadema has very limited means compared to people who are really able to compete in the big world of collecting. But Tadema, so in fact, very few objects in Tadema's house are particularly valuable. The birdcage and the bed are two sort of exceptions, but you can see they're decorative objects. And so he had hundreds and hundreds of things in, possibly some of the textiles are some of the more valuable objects in the house. But what interests me about these houses is the way the artist could bring all of these things that are really amazingly different in medium, in size, shape, everything, and by demonstration. And so these things are extensively written up in magazines and journals and in books as well, to make them exciting for people, and they are a stimulus to collecting and to making other interiors by people who would never have seen them, but would have been able to encounter them through these reports, and so that they circulate. And then, of course, the objects circulate. So it's really fascinating, for example, to find, and you say, that's the screen. I know it's the same one. And then, so I'm sure that again, just the same way, the first house, its objects move into the second house and get embedded there, or they're given to the Mesdag. So there's quite a few in the Mesdag Museum in The Hague. And again, and they probably have percolated into all kinds of collections all over the world. You probably got some of them in the museums that you all curate and run. So, any further?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. That was amazing talk. I just wanted to ask you whether this kind of arrangement with Tadema and his family members working alongside each other was, at the time, do you think it was a really exceptional and exceptionally unusual
No,
configuration?
I
Or do you
don't.
think actually it was a much more common practice and arrangement than we've come to think?
I think the second. I think it's much more common. We have to recover that. Now, for example, the Haler family, the women, the daughters in the Haler family, have come to some prominence in very recent years because their very exquisite pictures tend to get sky-high prices at auction because they're so beautiful. They represent the house interiors. It's a house in Henley. Which was next door to G.D. Leslie's house. So his father, C.R. Leslie, I don't think ever lived there, but G.D. Leslie was in that area. James Halar, the father, and I think there were 4 daughters that painted. There might have been more. I forget. Anyway, there were lots of them, and they painted the house interiors. Now, so people have been very interested in individual paintings by these people because they're so beautiful, frankly. But it would be a very interesting thing to bring them together and to try to look at them in the context of the house. I bet you there are lots of others as well. We just haven't looked for the data. Now, of course, there are also some lone people, such as, for example, Leighton. But Leighton House is more collaborative than you think. So, for example, one of the things we did in the exhibition was we brought back to Leighton House the panel that Leighton painted for Tadema's Hall of Panels, which is the tall, thin version. It's the first version of the painting that became Leighton's Bath of Psyche, Chantry purchase, now in the Tate. But when Tadema was asked to paint it, he famously held up his dinner knife and said, I think it was his dessert knife, exactly, and said to Tadema, "You want me to paint on the edge of this?" So, there was this lovely little interaction between them. He painted that little scene, and he then developed the composition, which therefore, that long, thin composition developed basically from being a door panel. So he gave that which became part of Tadema's house, and Tadema gave him the painting called In My Studio, this one. So Tadema painted that for Leighton, and you can see it in photographs of Leighton's silk room. So this, a piece of Tadema's house, was on display in Leighton's house in the 1890s. So, and of course we know that Leighton was buying lots of work by his friends and contemporaries and so forth. So there's much more collaboration, I think. The friendships are so interesting.
I'm from the Florence Rizal Museum, which Valerie
Oh,
just
great.
mentioned is having these kind of panel ensemble, and so I'm really curious to learn more about the Hall of Panels and what you just said about the format kind of being generative for further work by the artist is really interesting, but I'm also wondering if you could just say a little bit more about how much influence or how specific was Leighton with the subjects. I mean, just to find out a little bit more about, did he want these all to have something that would unify them, or are they really meant to be expressions of the individuality of these friends and fellow creators?
Yeah, so there are 45 of these, and we found 17, so look for the others, please. And actually, you can see there isn't room for 45 here, and I think this is what happened. He got so exuberant about it. They go right round the corner and up the stairs and so forth. We were a bit puzzled about where they all fit until we looked carefully at that catalog, which, by the way, the illustrated catalog, the only copy with the full set of illustrations that I know of is in the Royal Academy Library, and that was absolutely essential for allowing us to piece together some of the things going on in the house. So I think that people were just invited to make a panel, and there was sort of an idea that if you went for dinner, you'd probably have to paint a panel before you could go home, and they're a very interesting selection of painters. I should say we found 16 of them, and this image is the very nice display that was basically organized by Arnika Schmidt at the Belvedere Gallery in Vienna, just as a sort of a mock-up to display them in as close to original order as we could come to with the panels we actually had. Now, Daniel Robbins gave an interview to the papers in which he said there were 17 panels, which was actually erroneous. There weren't. There were only 16. But then, by magic, Rupert Moss turned up another panel by Marcus Stone. So by the time we opened, we actually did have 17, which making good Daniel's mistake when he spoke to the press, but it also meant that it coincided with Tadema's lucky number. 17 was his lucky number. Both of the houses had the number 17 to begin with. So it was quite right that we had to have 17 panels. But yeah, here they are at Leighton House. And this is the final one, which we just got squished in at the end there. So the panels themselves they're very interesting. They're by a very wide range of artists, and not necessarily all the artists that you would think would be friends with each other. Who would think you'd get, Sargent sitting alongside Emily Williams? But I can tell you they were actually friends. They were they both spent the summers in Broadway, and the Tadema family was very close to the Sargent's friends of that generation. And Emily Williams was apparently a mean tennis player. Tadema himself was terrible at it, but Emily Williams could beat anybody. So I mean these things they reveal networks that we didn't know about before. There's endless more things I could say about the panels, but I think I'll just stop there and say, please keep your eye out for panel. Anytime you see a tall, thin thing, think that could be one of them.
So I think it's coffee time now. So, but before we depart for coffee, let's thank Liz